May 10, 1940. France awoke to the thunder of German tanks crossing the borders. The Wehrmacht's blitzkrieg tore through Belgium and the Ardennes, bypassing the heavily fortified Maginot Line. For French civilians, the sudden speed and ferocity of the attack was unimaginable. Families packed hurriedly, abandoning homes and farms, seeking safety in towns farther west. News traveled slowly at first, rumors of German atrocities, captured towns, and collapsing divisions spreading fear and confusion. In Paris, the capital pulsed with tension. Civilians watched as military reports and radio broadcasts filled the air with dire news. Citizens whispered in cafes, marketplaces, and offices, sharing the same mix of disbelief and dread. Many were ashamed, blaming the government and military leadership for failing to prevent such a swift collapse. Others clung to hope, uncertain whether Britain might intervene decisively. On May 12, the first reports arrived of British Expeditionary Force (BEF) movements. Civilians observed the arrival of British troops in northern France, particularly in Lille and Arras, as news spread through newspapers and word of mouth. Among the Parisians, opinions were mixed. Some marveled at the discipline and courage of the British soldiers, seeing in them a glimmer of hope. Others, ashamed of the French military's failures, voiced frustration and despair. Pierre, a clerk in a small Paris office, spoke quietly to his colleague. "They fight while we retreat. Britain stands when France falls. How do we explain this to ourselves?" His colleague Marie shook her head. "I do not know. Perhaps we will rise again, we must hope." Across the country, families were displaced. Refugees fled along roads crowded with carts, bicycles, and automobiles, moving westward away from advancing German units. Villages emptied overnight as panic spread. Civilians listened to BBC broadcasts relayed through radio sets, though often at night to avoid German censorship. In those broadcasts, Britain's Prime Minister Winston Churchill promised that the fight would continue. Civilians in France heard, "We shall never surrender," and some whispered these words to one another, clinging to them as fragile lifelines amid chaos. By May 20, German forces had reached the Somme. Civilians in northern France witnessed the rapid advance firsthand. Families hid in cellars, watched towns burn, and waited for news of loved ones in military service. Children were evacuated from cities. The elderly and infirm were often left behind, relying on neighbors for aid. Yet through fear and desperation, conversations in homes and cafes revealed a sense of quiet admiration for Britain's commitment. In the coastal towns of Normandy, fishermen observed British ships preparing for evacuation efforts. Civilians noticed the discipline, the readiness, and the courage of the troops. Whispers circulated. "They will continue the fight, even if France has surrendered. Perhaps all is not lost." On May 26, the evacuation at Dunkirk began. Civilians along the beaches and in nearby towns assisted in any way they could, providing food, shelter, and guidance to soldiers. Many risked their own safety to help retreating troops board ships bound for England. Among these civilians, a mix of shame, fear, and admiration prevailed. "We failed our soldiers," an older woman murmured to her granddaughter as they watched columns of men march to the shore. "But Britain, they have not failed." Meanwhile, German forces advanced relentlessly. The speed of the attack left French military units disorganized, and surrender became inevitable for many. Civilians faced a stark reality. Their country would soon be under occupation. In Paris, citizens debated the meaning of resistance, the likelihood of survival, and the courage of Britain, which refused to surrender even as France collapsed. On June 14, 1940, Paris fell. Civilians packed into trains and automobiles, leaving behind homes and businesses. Those unable to flee remained, determined to survive under German occupation. Conversations among neighbors revealed a complex mix of despair, defiance, and hope. Some feared collaboration, others secretly vowed to resist. Many spoke of Britain's unwavering fight, holding on to the belief that one day France might rise again. In Bordeaux, the Provisional Government of France attempted to negotiate surrender. Civilians listened closely to radio updates and whispered conversations in the streets. "Britain fights on," a young man remarked to his friend as they watched German troops parade through the city. "Perhaps they will show us the way." British leaders, aware of the psychological impact on occupied France, issued statements encouraging the population and supporting resistance wherever possible. The BBC's French-language broadcasts became a lifeline, sharing news of British victories, evacuation successes, and defiance against the Nazi regime. Civilians tuned in at great risk, hiding radios, whispering messages, and maintaining hope against the despair imposed by occupation. In small villages across southern France, civilians whispered news from Bordeaux and London. Old men recounted France's proud military history, children listened wide-eyed, and women discussed the courage of soldiers across the Channel. Admiration for Britain's commitment blended with shame over France's rapid collapse. Many quietly vowed to support any form of resistance or collaboration with the Free French forces that would soon emerge under Charles de Gaulle. De Gaulle, broadcasting from London on June 18, 1940, called upon the French people to continue the fight. Civilians across France secretly listened, sometimes by tuning in at night or using clandestine radios. The words "France has lost a battle, but France has not lost the war" were whispered in cafes, markets, and homes. For many, this was a moment of renewed hope, proof that defiance was possible even as occupation loomed. Meanwhile, streets in Paris and other major cities remained tense. German occupation forces patrolled public areas, imposing strict curfews and controlling the flow of information. Civilians adapted to the new reality, speaking quietly, passing secret messages, and keeping their admiration for Britain and hope for eventual liberation private. The mix of fear and hope defined daily life, shaping attitudes that would later support resistance movements. By late June, British efforts to support France through propaganda, logistical aid, and evacuation had become apparent. Civilians in southern towns noted shipments of supplies, small numbers of British advisors, and continued broadcasts of encouragement. These efforts, though limited, reinforced a sense that France was not entirely abandoned and that the fight against tyranny would continue elsewhere. For the average French citizen, the combination of shame, admiration, and hope created a complicated psychological landscape. They had witnessed the collapse of a proud nation, yet saw in Britain a model of courage and persistence. Conversations in homes, cafes, and markets reflected this duality: fear of occupation and loss, admiration for British resolve, and quiet determination to survive and one day resist. Even children absorbed these sentiments. In Paris, schools attempted to continue instruction under German oversight. Students discussed the bravery of Britain and whispered of heroes like Churchill and de Gaulle. Civilians shared stories of Dunkirk, of soldiers returning safely to England, and of communities that had aided them. These narratives became seeds of resilience, preparing the population for eventual resistance. By July 1940, the French population had largely adapted to occupation. However, private conversations, underground networks, and personal reflections maintained the memory of national pride and the hope of liberation. For civilians, the example of Britain, refusing to surrender, fighting on, and sending messages of support, became a moral touchstone, a symbol of courage in the face of overwhelming adversity. By late June 1940, France had formally surrendered. The armistice signed at Compiègne left the country divided, the German-occupied north and west, including Paris, and the Vichy-controlled south under Marshal Philippe Pétain. For civilians, the shock was profound. Families returned to devastated homes, towns had been bombed, and the looming presence of German troops imposed fear and restraint. Conversations in homes and cafes reflected a mix of shame, disbelief, and cautious hope. In Paris, citizens observed the formal entry of German troops. Flags were removed, streets cleared, and public displays of occupation carefully staged. Civilians, while outwardly compliant, whispered to each other about the courage of Britain still resisting Hitler. "They will not surrender," a shopkeeper murmured to a friend. "If anyone can hold, it is them." The BBC broadcast from London, transmitted clandestinely across the channel, became a lifeline for these conversations. In coastal ports like Le Havre, Cherbourg, and Calais, civilians watched British naval operations. Ships had evacuated thousands of troops from Dunkirk, bringing them to safety. The civilian population, witnessing this coordination, began to develop a quiet admiration for Britain. "They fight on while our nation falters," a fisherman muttered to his son as ships moved steadily into the channel. "Perhaps we too can rise again someday." Refugees in southern France faced harsh realities. Many had lost homes, possessions, and livelihoods. Villagers discussed the collapse of national defense and the moral and practical failure of the French military leadership. Yet conversations also included admiration for Britain and its determination to resist the Third Reich. "They do not bend," an elderly woman whispered to neighbors. "Even as we are occupied, they fight." In Bordeaux, where the provisional French government had relocated, discussions among citizens reflected a combination of despair and hope. Families crowded around radios to hear de Gaulle's first appeals to the nation. His words, transmitted from London, offered guidance and inspiration. "The flame of resistance must not be extinguished. France has lost a battle, but the war is not over." Civilians whispered these words among themselves, framing them as both a moral anchor and a source of personal courage. As the occupation solidified, clandestine resistance began to form. Civilians shared news from London, provided food and shelter to escaping soldiers, and aided in the distribution of leaflets encouraging defiance. These small acts of resistance became symbols of hope. In rural villages, farmers hid British and Free French agents, while in towns, young men and women organized underground communication networks. Schools became secret forums for discussion. Teachers, under surveillance, carefully introduced students to the realities of occupation while emphasizing the need for courage and resilience. Students learned of the British stand in the Battle of Britain and de Gaulle's broadcasts, internalizing these lessons of resistance. Children whispered to each other, even if France is occupied, some will fight on. In Marseille and Nice, ports still active with shipping, civilians observed British ships delivering supplies and intelligence to Free French operatives. Conversations in local markets reflected admiration for Britain and for the Free French movement. They do not give up, a merchant said quietly to a friend. If we follow their example, perhaps one day France will be free. Meanwhile, German propaganda attempted to pacify the civilian population and legitimize occupation. Posters, pamphlets, and speeches emphasized order, efficiency, and inevitability of the Reich. Civilians learned to navigate this environment carefully. Public compliance masked private hope, whispered conversations, and covert acts of defiance. Admiration for Britain, the one nation refusing to surrender, spread through these private networks, sustaining morale in the face of oppression. In urban centers, stories circulated of brave individuals who aided the escape of French soldiers to Britain. Civilian networks coordinated with port authorities, clandestine contacts, and British intelligence. They fight on, an old man told his granddaughter, pointing to a small group of soldiers boarding a ship. Even when all seems lost, courage persists. These stories reinforce the perception that Britain's determination offered a moral example and potential hope for future liberation. The Vichy government, under Pétain, struggled to assert authority over the civilian population while complying with German demands. Civilians debated morality, survival, and loyalty. Some sought safety through compliance, while others covertly supported resistance networks. Admiration for Britain provided an ethical framework for those seeking to act with conscience. Discussions in private homes frequently contrasted France's rapid surrender with Britain's steadfastness. Across the occupied North, young men and women listened attentively to BBC broadcasts. Clandestine listening stations relayed messages of hope, resistance, and strategy. Civilians shared this information with friends, sometimes risking arrest or punishment. Conversations included speculation about future Allied operations, the potential return of Free French forces, and strategies for surviving occupation while preserving national dignity. In Toulouse and Limoges, towns in unoccupied Vichy France, civilians debated the implications of Britain's continued fight. Farmers, shopkeepers, and students discussed the courage of Churchill, the resilience of the Royal Air Force, and the determination of the Free French movement. These conversations were both aspirational and practical, a roadmap for moral survival, a model for action, and a reassurance that occupation did not mean the end of France. Throughout the summer of 1940, the contrast between Britain and France became a constant topic of civilian discourse. People compared their own nation's surrender with Britain's defiance, discussing the moral courage required to resist tyranny. In homes, cafes, and marketplaces, whispers of admiration for Britain mixed with shame over French failures. These discussions laid the foundation for later resistance movements and for solidarity with Free French forces abroad. Evacuees, displaced persons, and urban residents maintained a delicate balance of fear and hope. Civilians understood the dangers posed by German occupation, but also drew inspiration from Britain's example. "If they fight, so must we in our own way," a young woman told her brother as they hid leaflets and messages supporting the Free French. By the end of summer 1940, these whispered conversations, clandestine acts, and moral reflections had created a network of hope across France. Civilians, though physically occupied, maintained psychological resilience. Britain's continued fight served as both a practical and symbolic lifeline, guiding private morale and shaping early forms of organized resistance. By autumn 1940, life in occupied France had settled into an uneasy routine. German authority extended through the north and west, while Vichy France governed the south. Civilians adapted outwardly to curfews, rationing, and patrols, but inwardly private conversations and secret acts of defiance persisted. The continued defiance of Britain fighting alone against Hitler became a moral compass for these civilians, a symbol of courage and perseverance. In Paris, small gatherings in apartments and cafes allowed friends and family to exchange news and interpretations of events. Whispers of admiration for Britain were common, often couched in euphemism to avoid German scrutiny. "They fight on even when it seems all is lost," a schoolteacher whispered to a neighbor. "If Britain can resist, then we must endure and prepare for the day we rise again." Throughout France, networks of resistance began to form, inspired in part by British steadfastness. Civilians passed messages, hid refugees, and relayed information to agents loyal to General Charles de Gaulle. The BBC's French-language broadcasts, heard clandestinely at night, instructed listeners to support the Free French, maintain hope, and prepare for future action. Civilians whispered these messages, internalizing them as guides for both survival and moral courage. In the rural Loire Valley, farmers assisted fleeing soldiers, providing food, clothing, and directions to ports for evacuation. Many discussed the contrast between their own country's collapse and Britain's continued fight. Pierre, a middle-aged farmer, told his son, "We have lost the field, but we have not lost our spirit. Britain has shown the way." We must remember it. These conversations, though quiet, reinforced the belief that moral courage could survive physical occupation. Schools and universities became subtle centers of resistance. Students exchanged notes and spoke softly of Britain's resistance, the courage of Churchill, and the calls of de Gaulle. In small villages, children were taught secretly to read maps and understand geography for future acts of defiance. Teachers reinforced admiration for Britain as an example of persistence and strategic resolve, framing it as a model for France's eventual resurgence. In southern France, the Vichy-controlled region, civilians debated the morality of compliance versus resistance. Conversations in marketplaces, at cafes, and in private homes reflected a blend of fear, pragmatism, and hope. Citizens acknowledged the risk of German reprisals while secretly supporting clandestine efforts. Admiration for Britain's unyielding stance provided psychological sustenance, a reminder that resistance was not futile and that one nation could stand alone against tyranny. By early 1941, Free French forces under General de Gaulle began coordinating more actively with British intelligence and military operations. Civilians were instrumental in these efforts. Couriers, informants, and sympathetic officials relayed information across occupied and Vichy France, often risking imprisonment or execution. In Paris, Marseille, and Lyon, civilians helped distribute underground newspapers detailing British successes in the Battle of Britain, strategic developments, and calls to support Free French efforts. Families living under occupation often debated the morality and feasibility of action. Many feared reprisal, yet found inspiration in Britain's refusal to surrender, drawing courage from Churchill's rhetoric. "If they fight, we can find a way," whispered a mother to her children as she passed notes to members of the resistance. These personal narratives became part of a larger network of resilience, morale, and quiet defiance, preparing civilians for eventual liberation efforts. Civilians also bore witness to the daily life of occupation: checkpoints, curfews, forced labor, and German propaganda. In each interaction, private conversations reflected admiration for Britain. At cafes and markets, discussions of Britain's RAF campaigns during the Battle of Britain dominated the discourse. Civilians spoke quietly of heroic pilots, bombing raids, and the resolve of a nation standing alone against overwhelming odds. Throughout 1941, networks of refugees and escapees from France made their way to Britain, often guided by civilians acting clandestinely. Fishermen, innkeepers, and villagers facilitated journeys across the English Channel. Each successful evacuation reinforced civilian admiration for Britain and strengthened their resolve to resist. Whispers of "if they can fight, so can we" circulated, sustaining moral fortitude amid daily hardship. In northern towns like Rouen and Lille, civilians used subtle forms of protest, refusing to cooperate with German authorities, hiding radios, or distributing Free French literature. Discussions often referenced Britain's unrelenting defense as a benchmark for moral and strategic courage. "They continue, despite the odds," an elderly man told his granddaughter. "We can do the same in our way." As 1942 approached, civilians' admiration for Britain evolved into practical support for resistance. Small sabotage operations, intelligence gathering, and covert messaging became increasingly common. Civilians coordinated with Free French cells and British intelligence, translating moral admiration into strategic action. Each success, however small, bolstered hope and reinforced the notion that France had not entirely surrendered in spirit. In Paris, secret classrooms taught young men and women skills for communication, map reading, and intelligence work. Teachers and elders emphasized the lessons of Britain's resolve, discipline, courage, and persistence. These civilian-led efforts, while invisible to the occupying authorities, built the foundation for the future French resistance. Conversations in private homes reflected pride in these small acts and hope that liberation could come. By mid-1942, the psychological impact of Britain's defiance was evident across France. Civilians' stories of courage, quiet resistance, and clandestine support were widespread, forming a moral and operational network. People whispered about RAF raids, Free French broadcasts, and de Gaulle's proclamations, drawing both inspiration and concrete guidance for their actions. Admiration for Britain translated into sustained resilience, hope, and clandestine coordination. In smaller towns, civilians worked quietly to support fugitives, protect resources, and pass along information. In Lyon, the underground movement coordinated with British agents to smuggle supplies and relay intelligence. Conversations often referenced Britain as a moral anchor guiding action without direct oversight. Civilians discussed plans in hushed tones, teaching the next generation that courage could endure even under occupation. Across France, civilians maintained networks of solidarity, drawing inspiration from Britain's example. Stories of RAF bravery, Churchill's speeches, and Free French radio broadcasts circulated widely. These narratives sustained hope, strengthened morale, and encouraged participation in resistance efforts. Private homes, cafes, and marketplaces became centers of whispered education, strategy, and moral reflection. By 1943, resistance networks had grown, connecting urban and rural areas, linking civilians with Free French operatives and British intelligence. Civilian conversations, once tinged primarily with shame and fear, now included admiration, hope, and determination. Britain's unyielding stance against Hitler became a touchstone for courage, guiding both thought and action. Civilians engaged in clandestine operations ranging from intelligence gathering to sabotage. In Toulouse, Marseille, and Paris, young men and women memorized reports, relayed messages, and assisted in logistical coordination for Free French missions. Private homes hosted secret meetings and safe havens for operatives, demonstrating the direct impact of civilians' moral support for Britain on practical resistance efforts. As the war progressed, admiration for Britain remained central to civilian morale. Every report of an RAF victory, Churchill's speech, or Free French operation reinforced hope. Civilians maintained quiet defiance, supporting resistance cells and keeping alive the idea that France would one day rise again. Conversations emphasized perseverance, strategic patience, and moral courage, all modeled on Britain's example. By the end of 1943, civilians across France had internalized the lessons of Britain's defiance. Occupation was harsh, yet private conversations, clandestine actions, and moral courage created a resilient population. The whispers of admiration, hope, and determination sustained communities and prepared the nation for liberation. Civilians' efforts, guided by Britain's unyielding stand, would ultimately contribute to the success of Allied operations and the resurgence of Free French forces.